Ma'am. Good evening, ma'am, sir, and everybody present. The domain of law, unlike many other professions, is an extremely dynamic one. Furthermore, with the increasing popularity of non-adversarial methods of dispute resolution, a subject like arbitration law has assumed even greater significance. It is often said that a pound of arbitration is worth a ton of litigation. Today, as we assemble to discuss and delve into the evolution of arbitration law, it's in fact a sheer privilege to explain the same by two notables in the field. Honorable Justice Ms. Indu Malhotra, Judge Supreme Court of India, and Mr. Sham Diwan, Senior Advocate. We also have with us Professor Dr. Shri Krishna Dev Rao, Vice Chancellor, National University Odisha. Sir, thank you for standing strong like an anchor and helping us in putting up this webinar. Sir was also the founding faculty at NALSA, Hyderabad, and has also served as the Dean Academics at GNLU Gandhinagar and as a Registrar at National University Delhi. He is also a Fulbright Scholar and a visiting fellow at School of Oriental and African Studies, London, and University of Washington in Seattle. Sir has also actively worked in the areas of criminal law, human rights, legal education, and access to justice. Sir is a visionary and a dynamic person who has always patronized academics and works such as this. Without further ado, I would want to hand over the space to you, sir, for the welcome address.
Thank you, Manu. Respected Honorable Justice Indu Malhotra ji, Judge Supreme Court of India, keynote speaker of today's webinar, Sri Sham Diwan ji, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India, my young friends from CAN Foundation, distinguished participants and friends. I am extremely delighted to extend a very warm welcome to all of you for the webinar on the evolution of arbitration law in India, jointly organized by National Law University Orissa and CAN Foundation. I would like to share three thoughts today. Firstly, the idea of alternative dispute resolution methods, which has been there, more old ancient Indian methods, modern techniques, and then several increasing efforts, both in the legal education, legal profession, and judiciary, partnered together to see that how we can strengthen this concept of dispute resolution. That's a more central for the legal education, legal profession, and judiciary. And that's the real concern of the justice delivery system. And all of us, as students of law, have immense interest in this dispute resolution process. And as I already said, it's one of the central aim and function of the justice delivery system. Quick and speedy resolution of the disputes is the need of the hour. A common man can enjoy a number of advantages from speedy justice, less expensive, and secure confidentiality and final satisfaction. It should be a win-win situation. A person who loses a case, a person who wins the case should have overwhelmed joy when he comes out of either the court hall or any other informal dispute resolution process and method. Second thought I would like to share is, I know the experts are here, but briefly I'll trace the evolution of the arbitration law in India. Of course, with the globalization, particularly the mid-1990s, has brought enormous changes, particularly in the context of the economic globalization. And there was an increasing interest to search for alternatives to the litigation. From the mid-90s, and particularly with the advancement of economic globalization, and that resulted in 1996 Arbitration Conciliation Act. The then Law Secretary P.C. Rao was working several efforts to put this law together, and that was the 1996 Arbitration and Conciliation Act. The 96 Act would like to unify the legal regime, both domestic and international arbitration, and also improve the efficiency of arbitration by reducing judicial interventions. Even though we have 1940 Arbitration Act, but I would say that 1996 is a front runner which started creating an interest, and also both in the legal education and legal profession to start the arbitration and conciliation as a major important method of dispute resolution. We all know the scope of arbitration was widened to a great extent with the introduction of definition of commercial disputes in the Commercial Courts Act of 2015, and 2019 amendment is definitely a step towards the institutionalization of arbitration, because 1996 Act was a concept which was to bring together both the domestic and international, and that was the beginning of many of us taking more interest. And now we are moving towards institutional of arbitration and streamlining the some of the challenges and difficulties we have faced under the 2015 Act. 2019 Amendment Act further addresses the ease of doing business ranking, as well as making India as a hub of international commercial arbitration. In the pre-COVID and post-COVID, we have all experienced how it is important economic prosperity also. So economic prosperity is also as vital to the life, liberty, and livelihood. Lastly, the thought I would like to share is, what is the future of arbitration law in post-COVID-19 societies? We must also think the future of arbitration law in super global world. Somebody has said post-COVID-19 society is a super global world, and which is the testing time for the social cohesion and globalization. There may be more and more technology enabled online dispute resolution methods in future. So we all are here very eagerly awaiting to listen to the experts, Madam and Shyam Diwanji. So I stop here and I welcome you all once again to the webinar. Thank you one and all.
Thank you, sir. Now I would like to introduce our first speaker of a stellar panel we have today. When we first thought of having a lecture on arbitration, we wanted someone who's been an arbitration practitioner as well as an arbitrator. But luckily, today we have someone who's also been at the helm of institutionalization of arbitration and is now contributing to its evolution as a judge of the Supreme Court. I would like to welcome Justice Indhu Malhotra, who was the first woman to be elevated directly from the bar and was the second woman to be designated as the senior of the Supreme Court. If I keep talking about her accomplishments, I think we won't be able to fit it in the duration of this lecture. But I do want to tell you why she is the perfect speaker today, because she has just published her 4th edition on the law of arbitration. The 4th edition is completely different from the 3rd edition and is one of the finest commentaries. We all fail to understand how she's done it while being a judge of the Supreme Court. I've been working with Justice Indhu Malhotra for last 1 year, and on a slighter note, I want to tell our audience that how I've been requesting ma'am for last 1 year to take at least one holiday off. She's been working tirelessly on the book, and even after the book has been over, she keeps telling us that there are more judgments and she needs to add this for future editions. Now I think let's hear it from Justice Malhotra, if she can share her views on the evolution of law of arbitration in India. Thank you, ma'am. We welcome you today.
Thank you, Rajat. Good evening, Professor Rao, Vice Chancellor of the NLU University, Orissa, Mr. Shyam Diwan, Mr. Manu Maheshwari, Secretary of the CAN Foundation, and Mr. Rajat Lecter. Good evening to all of you. My very warm greetings to all the students of the CAN Foundation and participants in this webinar. I will broadly touch upon the evolution of the law of arbitration in India, beginning right from the first codification, which took place in 1899, which was the very first enactment and was based upon the UK Act, which was the English Arbitration Act of 1899. It was, however, applicable only to the 3 presidency towns, that is Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, and arbitration could only be invoked under this Act by parties consensually and not through court intervention. Subsequent to that came the CPC 1908, which had repealed the earlier version of 1882, and it contains section 89 with 2 schedules, which are not the 89 in the current Act, the current act is a fresh version which came in as recently as 2002. Now, in the earlier Section 89, it extended it to the entire territory of India. It was not confined any longer, so it came as a supplementing provision. And it also enlarged the scope that one could go in for arbitration. Even if a suit was pending in the court, it could be referred to arbitration. Parties could agree to it consensually. And so the entire scope was increased by the CPC. Section 89, as it stood in the CPC of 1908, was repealed, and a new version was brought about subsequently, which is the current version of 89, which deals with various modes of alternate dispute resolution. Now, the 1899 Act remained in force right till 1940. In 1940, it was the first substantive arbitration legislation which came into force in India, and that governed only domestic arbitrations. With respect to enforcement of foreign awards, there were two separate enactments. One was the Arbitration Protocol Convention, which of 1937, which was with respect to the enforcement of awards under the Geneva Convention of 1927, and the second was the Foreign Awards Act of 1961, which was for the enforcement of New York Convention awards. So that was the lay of the land, and that's how it proceeded right up to 1996. Now, the 1940 Act, it required that once an award was passed, it required to be made a rule of the court. Now, this process took several years, and after going through the gamut of appeals, the entire process became inordinate, and it took several years, and it ceased to be an efficacious mode of dispute resolution because court intervention was permissible at various stages of the proceedings. In fact, interestingly, Justice D.A. Desai, in his judgment in Gurmukh Foundation, he said arbitrations under the 1940 Act are where lawyers laugh and legal philosophers weep because of the amount of time taken for concluding a proceeding, and that it was also court intervention was very, very common, and it was permissible at almost every stage of the proceeding. So the whole process became long drawn and inefficacious. Post-independence, and especially in the 1990s with the opening of the economy, it became imperative for India to come out with a robust alternate dispute resolution mechanism, because foreign investors were certainly not willing to submit themselves to the jurisdiction of national courts. They wanted an efficacious alternate dispute resolution system which would be conducted by a neutral tribunal, and were not willing to submit themselves to the courts. So this made it imperative for us to reform our entire arbitration legislation, and that is when the 1996 Act was brought in. It was based on the model law, which was adopted by the United Nations Trade Commission, and we adapted it. We did not replicate it in entirety. We had adapted it to the conditions which are endemic in our country. And the 1996 Act was enacted by Parliament under entry 13 of the concurrent list. It was brought in, interestingly, for the first time as a consolidating act. It consolidated all domestic arbitrations and also enforcement of foreign awards. So it repealed three enactments: the 1940 Act, it repealed the arbitration and the Protocol Geneva Convention of 1937, and also the Foreign Awards Act. So all these three acts were repealed, and there was one consolidating act which was put in place. Now, under this act, the first part of the 1996 Act deals with domestic arbitrations and international commercial arbitrations which are seated in India. So part 1 applies to even international commercial arbitrations in India. Part 2 of the Act is in 2 parts. The first part is the enforcement of New York Convention awards, and the second part is the enforcement of Geneva Convention awards. I will pause here for a minute. I do not intend to dwell upon the enforcement of Geneva Convention awards because there is no award now which comes under the Geneva Convention for enforcement to the Indian courts. It was a convention of 1927, and I think since the past over 3 decades or 4 decades, there is not a single case which has come to the court for enforcement because it's an archaic convention of 1927. And probably it was brought into the 96 Act. Since the 1937 Act was being repealed, it was a carryover from that Act. So this is how the entire, and I will not touch upon part 3, which is basically conciliation, and for the 4th part of the 1996 Act deals with supplementary provisions, so I'm not going to deal with that. I will come to enforcement of foreign awards in a bit. I will first start with part 1 of the Act, which is which governs the domestic arbitrations which are between Indian parties and international commercial arbitrations which are seated in India. I wanted to clarify to you one thing, that the model law was not a treaty or a convention. It was a legislative template, and it was brought about to bring about some kind of uniformity in the world on the interpretation of certain principles with respect to the enforcement of foreign awards which took place in various countries which were signatory to the New York Convention. Now the 1996 Act, it was basically riveted on 4 basic principles. One was party autonomy. Parties had the autonomy with respect to the procedure for conducting arbitration. There are certain derogable provisions and certain non-derogable provisions. The non-derogable provisions broadly are with respect to fair and equal treatment, which must be there, lack of bias of the arbitrator, then with respect to the law which will govern under section 28 of the Act with respect to a domestic arbitration. The second pillar is the competence principle, which is that the tribunal is competent to decide on all issues, including jurisdictional objections. The third pillar is minimal judicial intervention, which is enshrined in section 5 of the Act, that there will be no judicial intervention except as specified in the Act. And the fourth was expeditious dispute resolution. So this Act was basically riveted on these 4 pillars, and a completely new system of arbitration was ushered in. During the 2 decades of its operation right up to 2015, there were several issues which came to light. One of the foremost issues was with respect to the nature of power under section 11, which is in fact referred to as the default power for making an appointment of the arbitrator by the Chief Justice, as it was in the Principal Act, whether it was administrative, whether it was judicial, whether it was a power which was conferred on a persona designator. What was the nature of this power? Now, this engaged the courts for several years until the 7-judge Constitution Bench judgment came in Patel Engineering, which held it to be a judicial power. This was, of course, legislatively overruled subsequently by the 2015 amendment. So this was one of the issues which did engage the attention of the courts for a long period of time. And with this was accompanied, if it is a judicial power, what are the issues which are to be decided at the threshold? Are some of the issues to be decided by the court before the reference is made, or are all issues which are disputed referred to the arbitrator, and what exactly should be the limits of the exercise of this power? The other issues which surfaced were on arbitrability of certain kinds of disputes. That was another issue engaged the attention of the courts. The third was an issue which specifically was raised with respect to government contracts on the issue of conflict of interest. Most of the government contracts and PSU contracts always had a clause that it was one of their nominees who would be appointed as the sole arbitrator. So the issue of conflict of interest used to surface before the courts, and this issue has now been resolved by the 2015 Amendment Act, and I'll come to that in a while. Another issue which was critical was the scope of interference at the Section 34 stage. And lastly was the enforcement of domestic awards under Section 36. The interpretation which prevailed under Section 36 was that the minute objections are filed, the entire award, it goes into suspended animation, you cannot enforce it. So it became very problematic because the party with the award holder would find it a challenge to protect itself or obtain interim orders, because the losing party would siphon off its assets and the award holder would be left with a paper decree. It took years very often to get the award, the objections decided by the courts because of the high pendency of cases, and it became very problematic, and it stared us in the face. India was rated to be an arbitration unfriendly jurisdiction world over. Another very important and critical issue which also came up was with respect to the applicability of Part 1 of the Act to foreign-seated international arbitrations. An error was made in the judgments of Bhatia and Venture Global that the provisions of Part 1, including Section 34, would be applicable to foreign-seated arbitrations. And this led to serious criticism amongst international practitioners and foreign investors who felt very frustrated because the scope of intervention and judicial review was far wider under Section 34 rather than under Part 2 of the Act. It was in these circumstances that the 2015 Amendment Act was brought in pursuant to the 20th Law Commission submitting the 246 report. And that was, in my view, the most significant milestone in the arbitration landscape of India. It brought about substantive amendments, and the first was that it provided a statutory time limit under Section 29 capital A of the Act, a newly inserted provision, which now provided that all domestic arbitrations would be concluded within a period of 12 months, which has since been increased by the 2019 amendment with an additional 6 months for completion of pleadings. In fact, there is no other statute in the world which has a statutory time limit for completion of arbitral proceedings. Secondly, the definition of court was substantially amended. With respect to domestic arbitrations, the court was the principal civil court of original jurisdiction in any district. And if the high courts were exercising original jurisdiction, it could be the high court. With respect to international arbitrations, high courts were vested with exclusive jurisdiction so that the matters would not go to the district courts and time would not be lost. Section 8 was amended. Section 11 was substantially amended. Section 11 now, the power was conferred, instead of the Chief Justice, it was transferred to the Supreme Court for international, commercial, and the High Court for domestic arbitrations to make the appointment if an application was filed before the court. The 2015 amendment also brought about the most important amendment by insertion of subsection 6A in section 11, which now provided that notwithstanding any judgment, decree or order of any court, the examination would be confined only to the existence of an arbitration agreement. It in fact legislatively overruled the judgment in Patel Engineering of the Constitution Bench, Bogara Polyfab, Master Construction, and several other decisions where issues of jurisdiction were to be decided by the court prior to reference. So it was made clear that now no further discussion except if you find the existence of an arbitration agreement, the reference is made and all other issues are now to be decided by the arbitrator. So it reinforced the competence principle because the Patel Engineering judgment had vested the jurisdiction in the court at the preliminary stage to decide certain threshold issues. This was now returned back to the competence of the tribunal to decide these issues, and they could no longer be entertained by the court. Subsection 6B of section 11 clarified that this power under section 11 would not be regarded as a delegation of judicial power. So this was also another aspect of Patel Engineering which was legislatively overruled. Section 12 contains substantive amendments with respect to conflict of interest. Every arbitrator whose name was proposed for appointment was required to give two statutory disclosures. One was availability of time and second was conflict of interest. And two schedules were incorporated in the Act, that's Schedule 5 and Schedule 7, which were based on the IBA conflict of interest guidelines, which are in fact treated in all other jurisdictions as soft law by way of guidance, but it was given a statutory flavor in the Indian Act. In fact, and then further in section 17, the tribunals were now empowered to provide interim relief once the proceedings, the arbitral proceedings commenced. One would not have to hark back to the court under section 9. This was a significant change made to empower the tribunals to provide the same sort of interim reliefs which could be provided by the court. It's in fact pari materia with section 9. The fast track arbitration was also introduced as a mode of dispute resolution where the arbitration could be resolved only on the basis of documents and one did not really require oral hearings. Lastly, the second point, the second last issue which I want to touch upon, which is very important, is that India has narrowed down the public policy exception for resisting in, for setting aside a domestic award on only 3 grounds. One is if it is procured through fraud or corruption. Second is if it is violative or in contravention with the fundamental policy of Indian law, not of any statute. It can't be a mere statute that you can set aside a foreign award. You can't. It has to be in conflict with the fundamental policy of Indian law. And third is it should be in conflict with the basic notions of justice and morality. So in the Indian Act is the only act in the world which has narrowly defined public policy. All other acts is just said in conflict with the public, in conflict with public policy. It's not being narrowly construed by statute. In fact, the same provision on public policy as a ground for resisting enforcement has also been replicated in Part 2 of the Act. It's pari materia, both under 34 and 48, the same public policy narrow construction has been given by the legislature. The ground of patent illegality, which was expounded in ONGC, has now been specifically introduced as a ground for setting aside a domestic award. But this would not be applicable to international commercial arbitrations which are conducted and seated in India. And lastly, section 36 was substantially amended. There would be no automatic suspension of the enforcement of an award on filing of objections. The party would be put to terms and a reasoned order was required under section 36. This was the main conspectus of the amendments which were ushered by the 2015 Amendment Act. And in so far as part 2, that's the New York enforcement of New York Convention Awards is concerned, as I just told you a minute ago, the same public policy definition was incorporated there also. And it was clarified by explanations that there would not be a review on the merits of the award by the courts in India. The legislative intent was clear to adopt a narrow and restrictive approach with respect to public policy to resist enforcement of a foreign award. Now, there are two other aspects which I want to touch upon before I come to the 2019 amendments. Now, what was the procedure for enforcing a country which was a signatory to the convention but was not notified by the government of India in the official gazette under section 44? Where would it go for enforcing its awards in India? So for that aspect, the 96 Act does not provide any remedy, but the procedure to be followed can be traced back to a judgment of the Supreme Court by a 3-judge bench in the case of Badat and Company, which was of 1964 for SCR, page 19, which provides that for a foreign award to be enforced in this country, it is inchoate until it is recognized by a court of the country of its origin, that's the seat court. Once it's recognized by the seat court, it comes to India for enforcement as a foreign decree and is then enforced under section 44 capital A of the CPC. So that is the procedure for countries which are signatories to the convention or non-convention countries. If they come with their awards to India, that is the manner of enforcing those awards. Now, contemporaneous with the 2015 amendments came the Commercial Courts Act of 2015, which set up commercial courts which would now conduct arbitral proceedings, and it would not go to the ordinary civil courts to expedite the process. Whether it was a section 11, a section 9, a section 34 or section 37, it was the commercial courts which would now be these proceedings. In 2018, there was another significant development which I do want to mention, even though it does not really pertain to arbitration. And that was an amendment was brought about to the Specific Relief Act. Section 20 capital B was inserted in 2018, which provided that suits in respect of contracts relating to infrastructure projects would be decided by these courts to fast track dispute resolution. This is also a very important development in India for the quick and expeditious resolution of disputes, even though it's not by arbitration, but it's suits which have been fast tracked. 2019 amendments were brought about for two specific reasons. One is that there were certain clarificatory amendments which were required after the 2015 amendment. For instance, in section 17 and one or two other sections, it provided for confidentiality of the proceedings, it provided immunity to arbitrators. So there were a few clarificatory and amendments which were brought about by the 2019 Amendment Act. But the main object of this act, the Amendment Act of 2019, was to transform the entire system in India from ad hoc to institutional. So section 11 was substantively amended. It now provided that the Supreme Court, with respect to international arbitrations, would designate certain arbitral institutions, and it would transfer the power, delegate the power to these institutions to exercise the default power of appointment. It would not be done by the Supreme Court. And this was with respect to international arbitrations. With respect to domestic arbitrations, it would also be similarly exercised by a panel of institutions which would be maintained by the high courts. Now, which were these institutions? It would be done by a statutory body called the Arbitration Council of India, which has yet to be set up. And that was conceived to be a promotional body which would promote arbitration in India, have various seminars, promotional steps, etc., to be taken, because India was certainly looking to be a hub of arbitration in this region of the world. It was not ascribed any regulatory powers, even though there was a misconception by various international practitioners that it was another regulatory body which was put into place, but there is no regulatory power which is ascribed to this body. In any event, I do want to mention that the amendments to Section 11 and Part 1A, which is Arbitration Council of India, have not been brought into force as on date, because the government is still considering the form in which they would like to bring it about, because there was a lot of opposition to these two amendments. But in my view, with these successive amendments since 2015, India's rating by the World Bank has substantially improved from 130 in 2012 to the 63rd in 2019. The government is set to achieve rank 30 within a short period of time, and they are therefore moving towards successive amendments. COVID-19 has brought about a sea change in the manner of conducting arbitrations. The use of technology in arbitration by online hearings through video conferencing has been the procedure which has been adopted since the past few months. There have been online delivery of documents through Google Drive, cloud-based storage, and other data management systems. In my view, since the past several years, arbitrations have become an extremely expensive affair. It was also becoming very long drawn internationally. It was very expensive for parties, even states, to bear the expenses, particularly with respect to investor state arbitrations. They were extremely expensive and would run into billions of dollars. I feel that the positive part of COVID-19 has been that all procedural hearings today are being conducted online. And I think this is a shift for the better. It has cut costs of unnecessary travel, unnecessary fees, and it has expedited the process. We have, of course, been using the same technology in the courts. I know it's not satisfactory to lawyers, but it will take time for us to resume personal hearings. These are some of my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. We also have with us Mr. Shyam Diwan. Mr. Diwan is a senior advocate at Supreme Court of India, as was one of the front runners in the fight against right to privacy before the Honorable Supreme Court. Sir has started his practice at the Bombay High Court. His areas of practice cover constitutional law and most branches of civil litigation, including banking, arbitration, securities law, administrative law, and environment. He is also a co-author of the book titled Environment Law and Policy in India, published by the reputed Oxford University Press, and has authored several chapters in other subjects. He has also assisted Supreme Court as a amicus for popular cases, including the Ballari case involving illegal mining in iron ore in Karnataka. Without mentioning the help that Mr. Diwan has extended to us would be our shortfall. Mr. Diwan has been one of the pillars of our flagship project, Project Dhananjay, which aims at launching meritorious young graduates into legal profession by providing them a monthly stipend. Mr. Diwan was one of those first senior advocates who came forward to help Foundation in its initiative of Project Dhananjay when we were looking for senior counsels to help us. On a mere request over email for delivery of a copy of Ken's biannual newsletter, he was magnanimous and generous enough not just offer his moral support, but also helped us in launching Project Dhananjay. Many other renowned senior counsels like Mr. Siddharth Luthra, Mr. Raju Ramchandran, and Mr. Nidesh Gupta also came forward to help us with him for launching the set. Foundation shall forever remain grateful for your benign assistance. Mr. Diwan will briefly be touching the following points: his experience as counsel in domestic arbitrations and international commercial arbitrations, the rising importance of commercial arbitration in India, changing and evolving attitude and approach of Indian courts to arbitration and awards, and building an arbitration bar and institutional arbitration. Sir, I would now like to call upon Mr. Divan.
Thank you very much, Manu. Justice Indu Malhotra, Vice Chancellor Rao, Rajat, Manu, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the CAN Foundation for inviting me to be a co-panelist along with the leading authority on arbitration. If there is one judge with an absolute grip and expertise on a particular domain, it's Justice Indu Malhotra of the Supreme Court, and she's our Russell and Mustill rolled into one. The book is is outstanding and is an absolute go-to when many of you sort of graduate out of your law schools. Some of you I know in the audience are already practitioners, but this becomes one of the go-to volumes which you will have to have in your library when you commence practice. So I want to also compliment the foundation, since I seem to have bought my way onto this panel, it would appear. But I want to compliment the foundation on the work which it is doing in supporting through scholarships young students. So please keep up with the good work. I think at a time like this, which we're going through this current phase, philanthropy and contributions are going to be an absolute key just to ensure the health and welfare of our fellow citizens. So as Manu mentioned, I thought I should give this a little bit of a personal twist, because Justice Malhotra has given you, a sweeping and accurate analysis, both historical as well as structural, of the main steps. So I thought we'll just step back and make a few sort of minor disclosures. I started practice in the Bombay High Court long before most of you were born. And in the early 1990s, I found myself doing a few arbitrations, working out of Mumbai. And so I thought I'd share with you 3 or 4 things which remain with me about those arbitrations. So the first thing for me, when I look back at my brief arbitration career as a practitioner doing arbitrations, was the great privilege it afforded me to appear before some of the great justices whom I had heard about, but I didn't have the great privilege of appearing before. And the first, of course, which comes to mind is Chief Justice Y.V. Chandrachud. So Indu must have appeared, Justice Malhotra must have appeared as a practitioner when she was at the bar ever so often before Justice Y.V. Chandrachud, but that was not a privilege which was mine. And so when I did an arbitration or two before him, it was just so wonderful, because now, I can connect those judgments with his immense courtesy and poise and his grace, which came across virtually at every hearing. And, the extraordinary bookends of a former Chief Justice at one end of the career, and then a sort of a young counsel who's sort of struggling and kind of figuring out as to how to make an adequate presentation, but always keeping his mind on the focus of the case, encouraging you along. So I think, to me, that is a real live law kind of connection with the past. And even now, when I read judgments of Chief Justice Chandrachud, to me, it's the sort of the memory box is, how he would have dealt with those very issues in court. Then there was also Chief Justice of the Madras High Court, Justice Chandurkar, who had retired by the time I joined as a practitioner. He was also an outstanding, very, very quick judge, absolutely to the point, full of courtesy, and a great privilege to appear before. And the second memory which I have, and that's actually the second point, because, as a High Court practitioner in Mumbai, and perhaps many of you are going to be High Court practitioners as well, you'll find that you're all affidavit lawyers, which is to say that you really don't know how the Evidence Act works. I mean, you study it at some point in a national law school, but there are so many nuances, and there's a reality of these particular provisions which come alive only if you have to use it. And if you are conducting an examination, a cross-examination, structuring objections, etc., which again never happened to me in the Bombay High Court as a practitioner, because we were sort of reduced to reading out affidavits, which I'll come to in a bit. So my, the best cross examinations that I've had, for example, were before Justice Chandurkar. And I remember this one witness, which I must share because it's an utter delight. So this gentleman came, sort of doffed like I am, in a blue blazer to, lend a little respectability and poise. And he went on and on. He was for the other side, and he introduced himself as a civil engineer, and he gave qualifications from, overseas and Indian universities. And then with great, poise, rattled out what he was meant to say on behalf of his client. Now, we had a tip-off, which was that he had no engineering degree. So it provided me with an absolutely delightful opportunity to present him with some real elementary, 10 standard physics and 10 standard mathematics kind of equations, which even Justice Chandurkar, sitting as the arbitrator, was aware of. And this gentleman couldn't, answer any of those. And the case entirely just crumbled. Now, this was, of course, a joy which many a practitioner who's doing civil suits would have had the occasion to savor. But it was not one for me. For me, it was essentially the working of the law through a trial, and the working of a law through the Evidence Act really came only through arbitrations. And then, of course, there was Justice Kania, Chief Justice Kania, also, who I had the privilege of appearing before as an arbitrator. And the way he would sort of guide you along was one set of tremendous memories. So, as a practitioner in the Bombay High Court, I should just add, there are 2 or 3 things, and that sort of will lead me into this whole business about the ease of doing business, which was mentioned by Justice Malhotra, which was mentioned by the Vice Chancellor, and the importance of arbitration as an alternate dispute resolution mechanism. Now, in Maharashtra, and there is one outstanding law, actually, which we don't realize, but the importance of it in terms of ease of doing business, which is not the Arbitration Act, but it's the court fee provision. And I want you to just keep this in mind when you're considering the larger picture. In many, many states across the country, there is no cap or limit on court fees, which means that if you are paying ad valorem court fees, if you're suing for a particular amount, you have to pay a percentage of that claim into the court. And then you know how delayed and how prolonged the dispute resolution system in India can be. The great advantage in arbitrations is you do not have to go through that. So if you take a number of states, I mean, I'm just mentioning offhand, I think there's Andhra Pradesh, for example, Punjab and Haryana, Rajasthan, probably Telangana, Tamil Nadu, all of which do not have a cap on or a limit on the court fee which you have to pay. So for a commercial dispute, if you're seeking a recovery of money, your only choice is really arbitration. So this is one huge limiting factor. The second huge limiting factor, as I see it in the largest context, is we do not. I mean, you will be studying suits and the CPC, etc., in law school, but when it comes to the actual working and applying of that through a trial process, it happens ever so slowly through the Indian court system in most commercial causes that it's absolutely unreal and ineffective. So clients who want justice, who want to recover money, have no choice but to go to arbitration. So I think when we're looking at the larger issue of access to justice and quick commercial dispute resolution, I think we have to have a raft of reforms. Not just, I think it's a good beginning in terms of the Commercial Courts Act, in terms of the amendments to the Arbitration Act, but I definitely feel that you have to have a cap or limit on court fees if you're going to permit system, if you're going to have to allow people to come and sue for the recovery of money. So that's why you have either arbitrations at one end and you have, the consumer disputes, etc., at the other end where you're recovering some money again without paying nominal fees. Otherwise, so this is just one point which is on the side. So if you have a system, if you want to really improve your commercial dispute resolution, you need something which can give you a fair, reasonably transparent, open, efficacious system and give you that decree and the money in hand. And as Justice Malhotra said, under the 1940 Act, it was the expression there to challenge, oh, by the way, I should mention this, that just, I think it was the beginning of 2020 or maybe it was late 2019, I appeared in a Supreme Court case which was under the 1940 Act. So this was an arbitration which obviously started sometime in the 1980s, and it was sort of limping along through the various tiers of our system, and it kind of eventually made it to the court. So don't think that in your careers you're not going to encounter cases of the 1940 Act. Likely you are. So anyway, brace yourself for that. It's good to know those principles as well. But the expression the Act 1940 Act essentially used was the arbitrator misconducted himself. And that became a catch-all phrase by which you put every type of error which the arbitrator may have committed. And that's how the law sort of developed and evolved. And frankly speaking, I think the problem, and this is really an issue of approach, no matter how and how clear the language of the statute is going to be, unless our superior court judges are willing to say there will be individual cases of injustice, but to remedy those individual cases, we are not going to drive a sort of coach and four through the general principles of law. Unless you're willing to give up and allow individual case injustices, I don't think we can save even the 1996 Act post all these amendments. Because there are going to be public sector companies and governments which are going to come up to the Supreme Court of India saying that, look, this is so wrong. Where are we going to get the money from? Look at the manner in which this particular award has been rendered. Surely it shocks your conscience. And that's going to be the crucial stage and the crucial question. Because the moment you open the door, even a little, you're going to have a whole bunch of high courts and, practitioners who are paid to help their clients, who are going to wedge this thin little exception which you have made into a wider kind of exception, and thereafter allow a whole amount of judicial review, which will become virtually appellate review in terms of interference by the court. So this is going to be the acid test, according to me. We failed in 1940 to, limit it. The legislature came in 1996. And I mean, I don't want to go through the litany of cases, but I think the language, frankly, in the 1996 Act pre-amendment was fairly clear that the courts have very, very limited roles. But the cases came up where the justices felt that, look, this is a particular injustice in this case. And so they had to interpret the expressions widely to help a particular party which they felt had been wrong. I think we will have to step back from that and come back from that if we are going to have a situation where we are going to adopt an approach consistent with global norms, which is what Justice Malhotra mentioned, in terms of not just ease of doing business, but the global norm, which is that when parties go before an arbitral forum and an arbitral tribunal, that's the end of the case. You cannot really then expect parties, awards to be set aside, except in, I mean, this is also not a very, very, what the court uses in certain other contexts, the rarest of rare cases. But that perhaps is even too wide. I think we need a statistical analysis. You need a statistical analysis in terms of, look, let's see how many courts, as a percentage, English courts, Singapore courts, Australian courts, other Commonwealth jurisdiction courts, as a percentage, how many courts, how many cases or awards are upset. And let us try and move towards that percentage overall. So that's one part. The other thing which I want to tell you is that for those of you who are students and planning to practice, I think arbitration is a great field. It's for the reasons I mentioned and the reasons that Justice Malhotra mentioned, and indeed the Vice Chancellor mentioned in terms of alternate dispute resolution, going to be a growing area. So I think there is every prospect that with institutional arbitration sinking its roots, because we don't have, it's all theory that you have a commercial courts dispute resolution system. There is none, because it can't give you a verdict and a decree which is enforceable in a short and a reasonable period of time. So absent that, you need an effective arbitration and dispute resolution machinery, and we have institutional arbitrations which are inevitably going to grow. What will that require? So I see a huge prospect in the scope for those of you who are thinking of doing commercial law in not just our big commercial cities, but even in other places. That yes, arbitration is something which you could certainly specialize in. You will then have to decide, because for some of us, I mean here I'm sort of particularly guilty, but I virtually do no arbitrations. But the thrust and parry in a courtroom is completely different from an arbitration, which is is such a dignified and nice setting. But for some of you who sort of get an adrenaline kind of a high through court processes, an arbitration is obviously not for you. But for those of you who much prefer, at the end of the day, saying that, look, I have tick marked these 4 things and I have attained these because you prepared an extremely well prepared pleading, a persuasive argument in court, before a panel of arbitrators. I think that's really a career choice which would be very beneficial in the near term and in the long term itself. I think with this time frame, which Justice Malhotra mentioned, you are going to now have an insistence by arbitral panels that we're not going to hear cases only at 5 in the evening or on weekends. We are going to structure these cases as we would in court, with a morning session beginning at 10 or 10:30. And once that comes in, inevitably, you're going to have a specialist bar which will develop. And I think that's going to be a very, very good thing, both for the junior bar, both for the disposal of cases, and for a degree of specialization and confidence which inevitably comes in. I was also asked, I mean, I have, if my experience in conducting arbitrations is thin, my experience in conducting international arbitrations is thinner still. But for whatever it's worth, let me share a couple of experiences. First, I think in international arbitrations, what I have found is that the amount of effort which goes on in preparing pleadings, in preparing witness statements, and in preparing your final arguments is in multiples. It's 10 and 15 times what you would for an Indian domestic arbitration case, at least in my experience. So I think if you get a chance to do an international commercial arbitration, please grab it, because you will just hone your skill set and lift your skill set to a level which otherwise is difficult in our local domestic milieu. So one, the quality of pleadings, you suddenly really have to step up. The manner in which you structure your pleadings. You can't take up just about every nonsensical defense, which comes in a standard kind of template in terms of a written statement, which you may take before a court. So it's much, and then you see the capacity of the international arbitrators, where they are able to really pinpoint the issues down to 2 or 3 things. So that's very important. The other thing which I found is that most of these cases really get decided on documents. So it really improves your forensic skill on how to analyze documents, how to approach documents, how to persuade a tribunal on documents, because that's what they really deeply study and what they grapple with. Officers in companies come and go, but the document remains. The contract remains. So that's something else which you might carry home. And I think a very good thing, actually, just as I expect that this perhaps webinar is being recorded, in international commercial arbitrations, and now we have, of course, a Supreme Court judgment which indicates that we should have transcripts, at least in important cases. You have recordings which take place. So they're not the video recordings which we're talking about here, but you have simultaneous transcription which takes place. And so at the end of the day, you have virtually every word which is uttered by any party recording. And that's really beneficial, because it introduces such a lot of discipline and rigor and economy, actually, and efficiency into the process, because everyone knows that should they make a statement which is loose or improper, or for whatever reason not appropriate in an arbitral setting, it will be recorded on the next day. So it, I think, makes all of us more efficient. But this is something which I took away from an international arbitration, and I understand that that's very much the norm. I think once we have that now with recording devices such as this webinar, I think you can do it at a very low cost. You don't even require very high, very expensive sort of transcriptors or shorthand stenographers to record as to what is happening word by word. So that's another point which I made. The Vice Chancellor mentioned COVID-19, and actually one of the arbitrations that I am doing over here is going on actually currently through the webinar, not the webinar, I'm sorry, through a video conferencing software. And I think it's pretty efficient and it's going on pretty well. It's not overtly complicated. It's a sole arbitrator. So he's at one place and not sitting at three places. And I think it's proceeding fairly efficiently. So that was my response. But I thought I should share with you an acronym which I learned, and which is VUCA, V-U-C-A. Maybe some of you are familiar with it, but I learned about this through my friend, the management guru, Walter Vieira. And VUCA is apparently a management expression for, acronym for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So we are in a VUCA period right now. I mean, it's so volatile. It is so uncertain. It's so complex and ambiguous that we really can't peer very far into the future and tell as to how is it going to be business as usual. What's going to really happen in this? But I think efforts and indications are, and I've been sort of following this through friends across jurisdictions, that yes, international arbitrations, as Justice Malhotra mentioned, at least as far as the procedural aspects are continuing. Domestic arbitrations on a small scale through a video conferencing can proceed. The criminal justice system in many parts of the world has come to a standstill, where there is reliance on, or where you have jury trials as a matter of right. So that's a huge limitation which has kicked in. I was listening in to a Queen's Counsel who practices in the royal courts, and she shared with me a very interesting. She shared on this at this webinar a very interesting website, which I think would be of interest to all of you. This is in the UK, and she had a hearing before a court, and she said she was the only one on a camera, and so she was just looking at herself, at her own face. And the reason was that all the other barristers were actually on a phone. And we don't realize it, but quite apart from the fact that we take for granted that all of us have phones, which we have equipment which we don't. Many lawyers at the bar don't. Many persons and practitioners don't have the capacity to handle it, even if they have the devices. But even in an advanced jurisdiction, or what we consider an advanced jurisdiction, such as the UK, at home during the lockdown, you might have just one or two devices, and those are shared with other family members. So there are children who are on school at that time. There are other people who have access to those, and everyone doesn't necessarily have a computer before them, because the computers, etc., or at least the work computers, are probably in office, which you can't access because of the lockdown. So there are problems which are occurring across jurisdictions. So I'm not really sure as to how this will play out in terms of the arbitration world, but I do believe that as between courts and arbitral tribunals, I think we are going to be much, I think arbitrations are more likely to proceed and recover and proceed apace before the court physical hearing process begins. I think I'm kind of done in terms of time. So I will pause here and thank all of you very much, and probably take a few questions if there are any. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, sir. I think like the very fact that we've had the most number of registrations in the middle of a global pandemic shows what kind of a stellar panel we have. Ma'am, would you be able to take a question or two? Would you have the time to take a question?
Yes.
Yes.
Go ahead.
A lot of people have, yes, ma'am. Ma'am, a lot of people have been asking that would we be better off with a different regime for domestic and international arbitrations? And should we have specialized benches for arbitrations considering the pending applications, the rising number of pending applications in the Supreme Court?
I certainly am of the view that it would be preferable to have two separate enactments because the regime are entirely different and distinct. In fact, I think that was the cause which occasioned the error in the judgment of Bhatia and Venture Global. By referring to provisions of Part 1, Part 2, there was a confusion which got created, which was eventually cleared out in Balco. But I think the acts should be entirely separate. And in fact, there are certain other jurisdictions like Singapore, Switzerland, Australia, they all have separate enactments. And I think the enactment for enforcement of a foreign award should be distinct. I don't think it was a very great idea to have a consolidating act. I think it would work much better and more efficiently to have two separate enactments. Secondly, insofar as specialized benches is concerned, we mostly have one or two benches which are given the arbitration roster. So if there is a specialization and matters are allocated accordingly.
Someone has asked a question that India parties have generally been preferring an ad hoc arbitration as of now. So do you think that an institutional, am I audible now?
Your voice is breaking. Could you speak again?
I'll speak the question for you, ma'am. Ma'am, the
Yes.
question was that we have that Indian parties are coming a lot with ad hoc arbitrations. Do you think that like it's high time that we move towards institutional arbitrations and how it might really help the whole landscape of the arbitration?
It will certainly help because arbitrations, when they were ad hoc, went on endlessly. I regret to say, but a lot of retired judges would let the arbitrations keep on pending because they were charging on a per hearing basis. And I think the 2015 amendment has made a tremendous change by placing a statutory time limit. And if there is an institution which is monitoring it, it is far better because the entire procedure is timeline, collection of fees, disbursement of expenses, and all is taken care of. And there are institutions like ICC which review the award before it is released to ensure that it is compliant with all procedural requirements. So I think institutionalization is certainly a step forward, and I would recommend that.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for taking our questions. We know it was very hard for you, but you're always upcoming to help the students and address them. Ma'am, we really thank you. And now we'll have questions for Mr. Shyam Diwan. But ma'am, thank you so much for coming today, ma'am.
Thanks.
Thank you, Justice Malhotra.
Thank you. Thank
Am
you.
I audible, sir? Am I audible, sir, now?
Yes, yes. Shoot, Manu, I can hear you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, someone has specifically asked this question that the responsibility to develop and evolve any field of law is not only on the judiciary, but also on the bar as well. Speaking about the bar, there are full-fledged arbitration bars that are functional in other parts of the world. But in India, we don't have any such opportunity. What should be the steps that should be taken in order to establish a full-fledged functional arbitration bar and at a national level?
So I think the answer lies in part in what Justice Malhotra just said, which is her endorsement of institutional arbitrations. When you have institutional arbitrations, there's a certain rigor which comes in terms of rules and regulations, etc. So that's one. Number two, what you will find is that you will have institutional arbitrators who are appointed to that particular panel, insisting, as I had indicated, on having hearings during full court days. I think that makes the difference. Once that comes in, let me tell you, a specialist bar will immediately develop, okay? Because the bar, if you have a persuasive lawyer, like I'm sure many in the audience are, who can persuade an arbitrator, no, sir, 5 o'clock, I have a court case here and a trial court there and this and that and the other. And the arbitrator then eventually relents and says, yes, all right, very well, come on the weekend, come on a Saturday, come on a Sunday. Then that's not going to work. But once a norm develops, you will definitely have a bar. I'm happy to say that we have a number of my colleagues who practice in Mumbai, and I know a few even further afield. You see, you've got specialist practitioners of two types. You have certain construction lawyers of arbitration who are, who are absolutely specialized in those fields and who spend their time, therefore, doing, say, arbitrations in construction law. And so that's been there for many, many years. But then outside of construction law, you also have an evolving field now of an arbitration bar in at least cities like Mumbai, in Delhi, and there are other specialist practitioners as well who take it up. And they choose, therefore, and they've chosen, therefore, to stay away. Now, what does that mean? The first thing it means is that you must have an opportunity to grow through that arbitral bar. And as you know, under our system, lawyers aspire at some point to be designated as a senior advocate. So it becomes very important that a channel is opened to ensure that there's consultation by the high courts and the Supreme Court to find out from the arbitration community as who's competent, is she doing well, is she deserving of designation. That message has to come out, because otherwise you will have practitioners who will not want to go to tribunals and arbitral tribunals, because they fear that, look, I mean, if you know, initially you go everywhere, but then you fear that, look, unless I'm seen in the High Court and I'm seen in the Supreme Court of India, I may not be designated down the line. People will ask the question, who's this? I don't know X, I don't know Y. So I think that becomes a very, very important stepping stone and a channel of communication between the high courts and the Supreme Court and these, you know, parallel jurisdictions which are developing. So you have practitioners of great competence and ability in your tribunals, with the what I term as the very unfortunate tribunalization of justice in our country. But be that as it may, that's for another seminar. So we've got to pick up these people. If you pick up these people, identify these people, or a specialist bar will develop. And for international arbitrations, of course, that's very, very time consuming, very, very demanding. And therefore, if you are drawn into that kind of field, inevitably, of course, word gets around that you're in that field, but then you will be specializing in that, because you'll be, you know, completely committed in terms of several days for a particular matter.
So we'll take one more question.
Okay.
Yeah. So, as you also mentioned, that an international commercial arbitration is a different ball game altogether. So there were a lot of concerns earlier that a lot of Indian arbitrators who get appointed on the panel of an arbitration tribunal in the international commercial arbitrations, they're not really dominant. They often get dominated by the other foreign arbitrators. What's your take on it? What do you think? Like, because a lot of people have said that arbitration is a pre-litigation and a post-litigation step, because also the judges remain the same. They are the same judges we see in the courts, and then they are the same arbitrators. What do you think should change in that process?
Well, it's a tough one for me to argue. I can tell you this. I have heard about Indian arbitrators having outstanding reputations in the global market, and I have heard of Indian arbitrators who are so completely unfamiliar. And here, I'm sorry to say, but one must blame the government of India, because in a large number of high stakes public sector kind of arbitrations, I have seen the kind of transcripts and the orders and the conduct of the appointed arbitrator, and it is really, really unfortunate. And that is what gives you a very poor name and standing. On the other hand, there are certain arbitrators who are very highly respected in the international domain as well, who happen to be Indian and who are respected globally. So I think it's a learning process. I mentioned the learning process because I expect most of our audience today are, at least today, maybe they'll rise to be judges, but they are today students or they are young practitioners. And there was a learning between, you know, court and arbitration. There's a learning between Indian arbitration and international arbitration. And I think there is a considerable amount of learning for Indian judges who are transiting and moving forward into an area where they are conducting or participating as Indian arbitration, as international arbitration. So that's a nice thing. You know, you're learning something new, but that requires a quality of, you know, giving up the fact that you were a Supreme Court of India judge, forgetting that and starting all over again. I think that's a human challenge more than an individual kind of a thing. So, I mean, maybe we will have some training and then we will be able to contribute as well. But I think one point which you did mention is, I think for if you want to be appointed as an international commercial arbitrator, I think you've got to be willing to work very hard. So if you're unwilling to work hard and read all the pleadings before the parties and write a judgment, you're obviously going to play second or third fiddle, which is no good. If you want to be, front and center and influence the course of an arbitration, you have to have a complete command before the arbitration starts of the pleadings, of the evidence, and an ability to write and a willingness to write the award. If you're too lazy to do that, and if you're just enjoying the ride, then that's not going to sort of enhance your reputation.
Thank you. Manu, you can now take over.
We have a PPT just for 30 seconds. Just a PPT. Achyut, can we have the PPT, please?
Well, although sort of every day seems to be a Saturday, this is a Saturday evening, nevertheless.
And we are very grateful for Saturday evenings.
Sir, we are having a small PPT presentation about a foundation for Honorable Miss Justice Malhotra's viewership, what our foundation has been doing for national law universities across the country.
That's very impressive. I'm very happy you all are providing financial support to a lot of needy students to carry on with further education.
Very much, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. This was indeed a really engaging and enriching session, and I'm really grateful to Honorable Justice Malhotra and Mr. Shyam Diwan for their valuable time and their gracious consented for the webinar. Lastly, all the attempts towards putting up this webinar would have been incomplete had we not received the tremendous support from Professor Dr. Shri Krishna Deva Rao, the Vice Chancellor, because he has been helping us at various fronts. Thank you, sir, for standing for us and enabling this intellectually stimulating discourse. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Justice Malhotra. Thank you, Rajat. Thank you, Manu. Thank you, Vice Chancellor.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.